Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. We are joined by a very special guest today, one half of the Duran, and also you can find him on his own personal YouTube channel, and I suggest you do if you want to really find out what is happening in this crazy world. Alexander Mercouris is joining us today from London, and we are going to be talking about Russia, Iran, the United States, and everything that is going on. So, Alexander, how you doing today? Thank you for joining me.
I'm doing very well, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today, Jackson. We got so much to talk about potentially.
We do. If you could, I obviously we're going to talk a lot about Iran in a moment, but something that's not getting a lot of attention right now are the big gains that Russia is making on the battlefield. Could you provide an update as to how the SMO is going? And as I understand, in the month of, I believe it was last month, I think in May, it was like the largest gains that they've had since the start of the SMO.
Absolutely, and I think the pace is accelerating, and you get the sense of a Ukrainian military that is basically just hanging on in a few places. Now we can go into the weeds if you want. I mean, the Russians seem to be close to encircling an important town called Pakrovsk, which I'm sure we've all heard about. But it seems that we're getting fairly close to that. And the Russians are also making big moves around Konstantinovka, which is the southern of three big towns, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka. Konstantinovka is important because if it and Pakrovsk both fall, that leaves Slavyansk and Kramatorsk as the only parts of Donbass that would still be under Ukrainian control. And I don't think they're defendable by themselves. I think at that point, you will see Ukrainian resistance in Donbass collapse. And even as that's happening, the Russians are creeping forward in Dnipropetrovsk region towards the river, and they're also creeping forward in the north as well. The main push is in these central places around these cities. But if these cities fall and the Russians move decisively, these other places in the north and to the river, then that could be a knockout blow, because the central regions of the river, the Dnieper, is Ukraine's heartland, whilst in the north, that's where Ukraine's capital, Kiev, is located. So you can see how we're moving closer and closer to that point. And every day we hear more problems with the Ukrainian military, that it's short of men, desperately short of men. Putin said that it's only 47% up to strength at the moment. Short of drones. This is new, but apparently it's becoming serious. Short of artillery, short of shells, short of infantry fighting vehicles, short of tanks. So the war appears to be reaching a decisive point, the war in Ukraine.
So, and as I understand, you got Zelensky, who's still begging for 0.25% of every NATO country's GDP, 40 billion a year. But Trump, besides maybe some intelligence and some U.S. special services, they're not providing a whole lot of aid to Ukraine right now, right?
Well, that's what they say, and I think it's probably true. I mean, they're not providing any financial aid, and they're not providing any weapons. And I think there are various reasons for this. One is that they can see that the war is lost, so why reinforce failure? So I think that is an important factor, and one which is not to be underestimated, and one which is consistent with the way the United States behaves. The United States often starts wars, puts an awful lot of resources into them, and then when it sees that they're not working out, it walks away. I mean, this isn't consistent with what most people imagine about the US, given its rhetoric. But you saw that in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and it's now playing out with Ukraine as well. So there are those factors. But I think Trump personally, anyway, isn't much interested in Ukraine. His major focus, as we've seen, is the Middle East. He's got also the Pacific to think about. He's not really very interested in Ukraine. He doesn't like Zelensky. As for Zelensky, I think his two priorities at the moment are these. Firstly, to keep the financial aid flowing from Europe. And I think it's the Europeans he's really looking to get the money to continue to go to Ukraine, because that's what binds the political system in Ukraine together. The money goes to him. He distributes it through these various agencies. That keeps everybody, ultimately loyal, if you like, to him. And I think the other thing that he has, which is his overriding concern, is to retain control in Ukraine itself. Even as Ukraine might be losing the war, his priority is to remain president, to continue to exercise political control, and to continue to do so right up to the moment when the final collapse comes.
And were you surprised? I think it was on the 12th of this month, right before the markets closed on Friday, and then we had a almost guarantee of war on Iran or strikes on Iran. Maybe it was a little bit earlier in the week, maybe it was the 11th or 10th, but we saw that Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson of the Russian Federation, came out and said that the United States had planned to have another round of talks with the Russians about Ukraine, and they made a conscious decision to say that they would not be participating and they would suspend those talks for the time being. What do you think that means for the future? Do you think this is a big development, and were you surprised by that?
It is a big development. We need to understand what it was all about. It was not talks between the US and Russia about Ukraine. It was actually in some ways even more important than that. It was talks about the normalization of relations between Russia and the United States. After Trump became president, he launched this process. There's been several meetings in Istanbul between middle-level officials, but they were sorting out the issues with the embassies. They were talking about lifting sanctions. There was some talk of restoring air links. And then suddenly, on the eve of the next meeting, the meeting, which is supposed to take place in Moscow, by the way, suddenly the United States pulled out. Now, it could be connected to the events in the Middle East that, with the United States about to attack Iran, they did not want to send their people to Moscow and to be talking normalization with the Russians and perhaps being exposed to pressure by the Russians. But I think there's probably a bigger agenda here, and that is that we see that over the last couple of weeks, the Trump administration, Trump himself, seems to have shifted decisively back towards the more hardline, hawkish, neocon side of his administration. And given that that is so, they clearly do not want normalization of the relations with Russia. And I think that he wasn't going to quarrel with those people at this time. And it may be that he too has given up on normalization with Russia. I think it's the end of the process. I don't think we're going to see it go any further, because I don't think that the Russians are especially interested in it either at the present time.
Mm-hmm. Now moving to the events of yesterday, and now probably moving onward, is going to be the main story that we're going to be looking at. Iran, the strikes on the nuclear facilities. If you could just give me your basic thoughts on, obviously, no one really knows what is going on inside those nuclear facilities right now in Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow, because as I understand, they haven't sent people inside yet, so we don't know. But just your thoughts on the escalation of this crisis and the decision by the U.S. to intervene.
Well, the United States has been in an escalatory cycle towards Iran. They basically gave the green light to Israel to attack Iran. They pretended for several days, or some officials pretended for several days, that this was a unilateral Israeli decision and that the Israelis were acting on their own without the assistance of the United States. No less a person than Donald Trump basically destroyed that myth almost as soon as it was being peddled. And as far as I could see, the real purpose all along was to destroy Iran's leadership and to undermine the government in Iran. That was why they were killing all those senior officials in Iran. They did so as negotiations with Iran to sort out the issues with its nuclear enrichment program were underway, which makes it all completely illegal under international law. and a straightforward act of aggression. I think that's an important point to make, by the way. It's not made enough by enough people, though it is something, obviously, that the Iranians themselves are considering. Anyway, it then became very clear very quickly that Israel couldn't finish this by itself. It could not destroy the enrichment facilities. It doesn't have the means to. It could not. It failed in its attempts to achieve regime change in Iran. So surprise, surprise, having gone up this escalatory escalator, the United States then went up further and joined the attack on Iran. And that's what they did. So they attacked the enrichment facilities. We've then had all of the people who were party to this decision, Vance, Hegseth, and all of those, saying, "Oh no, this is our only attack on Iran. We don't intend to have any more attacks on Iran. We're not planning regime change. Regime change isn't our objective." And again, just as happened previously, Trump comes along and he blows that all to smithereens. He now publishes posts on Truth Social saying, what a wonderful thing it would be if we did actually get regime change in Iran. So as night follows day, we're going to get another American attack. I don't know where it's going to come. I don't know what it's going to target. Khamenei is quite plausibly the person they'll be going for. But that's what this is all about. Nobody should be in any doubt about this.
And, there was a very interesting response from the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, who came out yesterday. He put out a 10-point response, I'm sure you saw, which was provocative to say the least. But there were 2 points he put out. He said a number of countries are currently ready to supply Iran with nuclear warheads. And he said the enrichment of nuclear material, and now we can say it outright, the future production of nuclear weapons will continue. Your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the Russian statements, they are in an absolute fury about this because they are, and this is a fact people don't realize, Russia has been, throughout its history, its modern history, both as the Soviet Union and then as Russia, the main defender of the non-proliferation regime. They have always been strongly opposed to any expansion or delivery of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union never provided nuclear weapons technology to any country. The United States did. The United States helped Britain to develop its nuclear forces. It looked the other way as Israel and South Africa did. It's had a bad history here. The Soviets and then the Russians have always opposed the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And what they're saying is this American attack on Iran, on peaceful nuclear facilities being used for civilian purposes, through which Iran was exercising a right it has under the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. You need to understand that the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty says every country has a right to develop to the absolute utmost level nuclear materials and energies for scientific or other uses, provided it's peaceful. They're not entitled to have nuclear weapons. And it's a trade-off. You're not entitled to have nuclear weapons, but if you have nuclear weapons, then you can develop nuclear facilities, nuclear energy, do all of those things, and get assistance from the international community in order to do that. The Russians are saying that this attack on the nuclear facilities in Iran has completely destroyed that contract, if you like, that the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty has. Iran was doing nothing that violated the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it has demolished the central principle of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has discredited the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the enforcement arm of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It now means that nobody will trust them because they were not only colluding in this attack, but they were even providing pretextual grounds for the Americans to launch this attack, and perhaps intelligence assistance to help the Americans carry out this attack. And the result is that nuclear weapons are now much more likely to be developed by Iran and by other countries. And here I should say, I had some information this morning from somebody who says he has contacts in Russia. I don't know to what extent he does, because I get this information from all sorts of people. But in the past, he's told me things that have turned out to be true. And he has provided the gloss on what Medvedev said. And he says that North Korea is now contacting Iran and telling Iran that they can have nuclear weapons. North Korea will provide them in return for oil. So there we are.
I've heard the same thing.
Yeah.
Not from the same person, I don't think, but I've heard the same exact thing, that North Korea is the one that made the offer. Yeah. Another interesting development here is that Maria Zakharova, again, foreign ministry spokeswoman, came out this morning, and it signals a very, not just big deviation from previous official policy towards nuclear Iran, but also towards the United States. Again, kind of another big chip in the block. She came out and said that she unloaded on Vance, who JD Vance said Russia and China don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. And she said, anyone speaking on behalf of our two countries better start with not supplying Kiev terrorist regime with deadly missiles and not militarizing Taiwan. How do you think this attack is going to, in war, really, it's not just going to be an attack, is going to impact relations with the United States moving forward?
Well, it shows how absolutely furious about this attack the Russians are. I think we need to have some backstory here, because the Russians were involved in the nuclear diplomacy with Iran. There is no secret about this. Trump and Putin have talked about it. It's there on Trump's own Truth Social posts. It's there on Russian readouts. The Americans actually asked the Russians for help, and the Russians said, yes, we are prepared to help with this. We're happy to take Iran's enriched uranium stockpile as part of any deal. Putin was supposed to be traveling to Iran some point over the next few weeks, partly in order to facilitate this deal. And then the Americans turn around and do this. The Russians are absolutely furious. They're seeing the collapse of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. They're seeing the United States lie to them, which is exactly what it's done. They see chaos as they see it spread across the Middle East, and they see an absolutely unprovoked attack on Iran, a country with which, by the way, they've not always had an easy relationship, but which is now a BRICS member state. So you get a sense of the anger from Zakharova's words, because Vance who's perhaps in some ways the most diplomatic member of the Trump administration, and the one who sometimes comes across as the moderate in these matters. Anyway, he purported to speak for Russia and China. And the Russians said, under no circumstances, no way can the United States, can any American official speak for us. This is unacceptable, and unacceptable coming from the Americans, especially at a time like this.
Mm-hmm. It's all very incredible. What I think will probably be even more shocking for the Americans might be what potential response Iran deals. And I think maybe some people are worried about Iranian attacks on U.S. bases or something, but based on what we're seeing right now, I mean, we're sitting here and it's happening right now. A second salvo of Iranian missiles is headed towards Israel. The air defenses are doing particularly poorly today for Israel. But also we have talk about closure of the Strait of Hormuz and also a withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Do you think this is going to be the first step in ever-going escalations that could result in a full-blown war, attacks on U.S. bases, Qatar, Saudi Arabia? Or do you think that these sorts of responses, if they completely move forward with Hormuz, with Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and with continued attacks on the U.S. proxy of Israel, might be enough to bring them to their knees?
I think the short answer is that we are absolutely now on the escalatory escalator, as I call it. The United States has not finished with Iran. Israel has not finished with Iran. There is no reason to think that Iran has finished with the United States or Israel. I mean, yesterday, Donald Trump, well, not Donald Trump so much, but other US officials were saying, look, we've carried out this one strike. We want to end it there. It doesn't end there, even if those officials were telling the truth, because the United States has now taken this action against Iran, very aggressive action. It's clearly involved with this Israeli attack on Iran. The Iranians have no reason to believe anything that the Americans are telling them. And we now have statements from Donald Trump himself, which basically make clear that the United States is joining in this Israeli attempt to achieve regime change in Iran. Now, at this moment in time, I think that the Iranians are probably being advised by their friends, by the Russians and the Chinese, to hold back on doing some of the things that you were talking about, closing the Straits of Hormuz, attacking American bases, enlarging the war. The Russians and the Chinese are probably telling the Iranians, look, at this moment in time, doing those things is not in your interests. What you should do is maybe continue your strikes on Israel. Certainly while Israel is hitting you, it makes sense for you to go on hitting them. And you put yourself gradually in a stronger position by doing that. But ultimately, to work with us, China and Russia, and we will provide you with what support we can, air defense systems maybe in time, intelligence, economic assistance, that kind of thing, so that you can withstand this blow. But don't escalate, because escalation can backfire on you, just as it is now going to backfire on the Israelis and the Americans. But it's all very well for the Russians and the Chinese to give advice like that. And the Iranians are themselves sophisticated people. And I think some people in Iran, perhaps the leadership in Iran, will want for the moment to follow that advice. But as we move deeper and deeper and further into an all-out war in the Middle East, and further American attacks on Iran are going to take us there sooner or later. Well, how can you expect, if one side is showing no restraint, the other to do so?
Yeah, it wouldn't make any sense, especially considering Iran has the capability to do all these things very easily. It would be extremely easy for them to do this, shutting down Hormuz, so on and so forth.
Yes.
But of course, huge ramifications for everyone involved. So, Alexander, I have one more question for you. And it was something that was sparked by Professor Alexander Dugin, the Russian professor. He made this like cryptic post on Twitter, of which he has many. I love them. But he made this post hinting at the fact that it was something that I hadn't seen reported. Maybe you were aware of this, but that Russia had offered some form of a union state proposal for Iran when the negotiations were ongoing for the current cooperation pact that they now have. But they offered a very high level, maybe not as high level as like Belarus or North Korea, but a very high level union state-esque proposal for Iran. And the Iranians, as Professor Dugin said, laughed in Russia's face. This was confirmed, basically confirmed by President Putin, and even the Iranian ambassador to Russia this week confirmed this as well. Do you think that was a mistake by Iran? We have no idea what exactly was going on behind the scenes, but do you think that this attack and all this stuff would be going on right now if they had not chosen to take the path of what they're defining as, self-reliance and independence and not being a vassal state? That's how people in Iran are framing it.
It was a tragic mistake, apparently, and I don't think this is really disputed, but because, as you correctly say, Putin confirmed it in one of his recent Q&As. What the Russians offered was an absolute defense agreement between Russia and Iran I understand it was roughly along the lines of what Russia has with North Korea.
Mhm.
And the Russians were also offering, apparently, work to build up Iran's air defenses and to integrate Iran's air defenses with Russia's air defenses, which would, of course, have meant a completely different air defense situation in Iran. Because as I think what we've seen is that Iran has some, or had some, fairly sophisticated systems, but it never had a fully integrated air defense system in the way that the Russians do. And that has made all the difference, because the very fragmented Iranian air defense system has not been able to hold together in the face of all of these blows. So Iran rejected this proposal, and Putin made that absolutely clear, that they said no. And Alistair Crook, who's former British diplomat, he says that the reason they rejected it was that the Iranian President Pezeshkian, who has wanted to improve relations with the United States, worried that if Iran did that, it would be seen in the United States as too provocative, and that it would torpedo his attempts to improve relations with the United States. Apparently, even Pezeshkian now realizes that that was shockingly naive. And I think shockingly is the operative word. I mean, how Pezeshkian could ever have believed that such a thing was ever going to, that he was ever going to improve relations with the Americans. I mean, it seems unreal. But anyway, it was shockingly naive, and that Iran absolutely should have accepted that Russian proposal. When the Iranian foreign minister, Mr. Abbas Araghchi, meets with Putin, I would not be surprised if the Russians said to the Iranians, look, this is your mistake. You've made this disastrous mistake, and now you've got to rethink this and start working with us. Forget about nuclear weapons from North Korea, which can only get you into more trouble. Go with us. We can help.
This stuff takes years to do. It does. Like to integrate air defense systems, all this stuff, it takes years.
Yes, it does take years. And it would also require a major presence by Russia in Iran, Russian technicians, Russian people, and all of this. And, one wonders how Israel and the United States would respond to all of that. But, well, it's probably still the best thing that Iran can get. If it can get a defense agreement with the Russians, it would make much more sense, it seems to me, than anything else at the moment. Given that, for the moment at least, Iran seems to have seen off the immediate danger of regime change. So we're probably in a long war. And over the course of a long war, the dynamics can change. The Russians can start to do things. The Chinese can start to do things. It's probably the better course than going ahead, at least I think it is, than going ahead and trying to import nuclear weapons from North Korea, which would just escalate the situation to disastrous levels and might provoke an Israeli response. We both know that Israel is perfectly capable of using nuclear weapons if it senses that something like this was happening. So, I mean, that seems to me the best of the bad options that Iran has in terms of its long-term prospects. In the meantime, what I suspect the Russians will say is, you do need to get a ceasefire. The way to get a ceasefire without making unacceptable concessions is to go on doing what you're doing with Israel. The Israelis have only a limited number of air defense interceptors. The Americans have only a limited number of air defense interceptors. If you just stick to your current course, the balance of advantage will turn into your favor, and then you can get a ceasefire on your terms.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a perfect note to wrap up on. Alexander Mercouris, thank you so much for joining me today. Everyone, I'm sure already knows, but your YouTube channel, The Duran, and then you have your own personal YouTube channel, Alexander Mercouris, and then we also have your Twitter now for The Duran. Is there anywhere else people should follow along with you?
I think you've named the best places. I mean, certainly my channel, my own personal channel, The Duran, and of course Twitter.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for joining me today.